Ellie's got an amazing role, but there's probably some myths and legends around that role and Formula One. So we'll get into that. But just as a bit of a background, Ellie's been in that role for 4 years, so perhaps about half, just over, in a COVID world, in a non-COVID world, and half in a COVID world. And Formula One has almost been the inverse existence of much of the rest of the world, because it's continued with lots of travel around the world. So there's that. But prior to that, Ellie did about 5 years at Virgin Media and 7 years at Honda. And so Ellie has a huge pedigree as a high-profile marketing leader. In addition, Ellie is on the board of the Marketing Society and also a fellow of the Marketing Academy, which was the thing that we were on the last couple of days. She's also, and we're very grateful for this, a mentor in our Mentoring Gen Z scheme. I think we're now clear of 1,000 mentees and booked up all the way to January, so we're probably going to have to increase the cadence there. But we're really pleased with how we're helping people at the beginning of their careers get into and thrive within marketing. And the obvious thing to say is that Ellie works in a male-dominated industry, and so therefore is a bit of a unicorn, but also an instance of somebody following their passion, which we'll hear about. And so I think we'll get lots of insights, yes, about Formula One, but also about leadership, about growth, about development. So many layers of texture that I'm sure are to come. So I'm really, really pleased you're on the show, Ellie, and it's wonderful that you've given your time to us and everybody who's listening in and indeed watching on playback. So very welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Richie. Really great to be with you this morning.
No, look, the pleasure is all ours, Ellie. And I'm sure, the perception being, from my perspective, clearly Mark gets to go to all the cool stuff. I bet you trump him, particularly in my mind, about the coolest job in the world on the one hand, but also the kind of just things that you must get exposed to and the kind of the highs and lows of working in your industry. But so let's go deep dive right into that. But first of all, I mean, obviously, the last year has been turbulent. But more so than that, you've actually been sort of on the heels as well, right? Traveling around the world during this time. So tell us a little bit about the experience over the last year for you.
I mean, in truth, sort of, Richie, it has been certainly sort of really, really up and down, and very sort of high pressure, high adrenaline, because we were actually in Australia for the first Grand Prix, which actually was cancelled with sort of fans waiting outside Albert Park to come in. So that was kind of March 2020. And everything unraveled very, very quickly. So there was sort of a case of being sort of up 48, sort of 50 hours straight whilst that sort of played out, with sort of a positive test result coming back from one of the mechanics, sort of engineers within the sort of McLaren team. And then quite quickly, with a series of kind of calls, the sort of Australian health authorities made the decision to sort of cancel the event. So that unraveled very quickly, and at the time everything kind of slows down in one of those very high pressurized kind of situations, and it's not until you kind of really stop and you sort of reflect as to sort of what collectively everyone had been through that you're like, okay, wow, that's a really big thing. So we started to see that weekend everything just sort of tumble quite quickly like dominoes. So all of the sports, it felt, quite quickly got cancelled, sort of seasons, leagues. And I think it'd be fair to say that by the sort of end of sort of March, just as the UK went into sort of lockdown, everyone was back in the sort of UK as a sort of Formula One sport. So we have 10 teams, 7 of those teams are kind of based in the sort of UK. And then sort of Italy and Switzerland for the rest. And I think the really sort of one of the elements I genuinely love so much about sort of Formula One is there is so much preparation that goes into the race. So clearly you see that, or it shows up from a driver's perspective and a team's perspective. But the details that sit behind putting on that sort of event and that sport is one of the best examples of teamwork. And yet, as soon as those lights go out, anything could happen. And that's so similar to, I think, how we've lived through the pandemic, or actually just life in itself. You don't really know what's kind of coming. However, I think that sort of planning and that constant kind of training and the striving to constantly learn and to improve set us up incredibly well to really sort of navigate. And rather than saying we're going to cancel the season, it was a case of we are going to find a way to have a season, because on the one side we have a duty to sort of all of the people employed in the sport, and to continue that. And outside of the immediate sport, in the sort of UK, it's an incredibly sort of rich and diverse number of partners and suppliers. So I think there's 45,000 people connected to motorsport in the UK. So there's kind of that one side that you want to sort of continue to sort of find a way. And on the other side, there is just the sort of recognition that we have a huge global fan base. And in times of stress, pressure, we can't forget that we are a source of entertainment and actually a form of escapism. And for many people, they had been experienced to huge changes, elements of life that we've never experienced before, grieving in different ways, that actually if we can get back to racing safely and sort of protect and support livelihoods, but also provide a level of entertainment, then collectively we should absolutely kind of give that a crack.
So Ellie, you talk about the sport being a form of escapism. Just to pick up on that theme, in some regards, you've escaped the worst of COVID in that you've still been able to travel. And I've heard you describe Formula One as a bit like an extended family.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a bit about what that family is, but also, in some regards, do you feel like you might have been cheated of some of the silver linings of lockdown, where people haven't had to travel, have had more reflection time? So what's the balance of the good and bad there?
So I'd say chronologically, I was in the UK from March 2020 to July 2020. And that sort of first period of time, if you recall, the weather seemed to be beautiful every single day. So it was fantastic to spend time at home and actually just to see some of the smallest changes that would often pass me by in the garden, or actually being able to kind of just go for sort of walks early of an evening, not having a 90-minute commute each way. And at that very first time, it felt really novel and really, really enjoyable. And there was a sort of high energy of sort of team Zoom drinks on a sort of Friday afternoon, quizzes at a weekend. And then I obviously started sort of traveling. And it's funny because when you've spent a period of time, and in my case, a relatively short period of time, but it was still something that was fairly alien to me to not be traveling and going to work. And that sort of first time of when you do go back to work and you start traveling, it actually feels quite scary because you're stepping into the sort of unknown. And whereas actually you've most probably gone about traveling a little bit blinkered because you're in this kind of routine and this process, actually when you haven't done something for such a period of time, all of your senses just feel like they're on the highest alert. And, you know, in truth, we could not have had travel any better than we had. So from a sort of health and safety perspective, with all of our sort of people, we're flying on sort of charter planes. So we're all able to get on sort of a normal size plane, but it is just us. Everyone's in sort of PPE. There's distancing on the sort of aircraft between teams. We're all PCR tested, flying into runways that are as close to possible as where the circuits are. So maybe you're not coming through sort of regular kind of terminals. And yet that first experience still felt sort of quite scary of stepping back in. But as soon as you get back into that sort of routine again, the positives and what I've really sort of valued is human interaction. So that interaction is different. We're wearing masks, so you sort of learn to read people's body language and expressions differently, because it's much more through the eyes than sort of what you'd see typically in the sort of lower half of the face with it being covered. And then just those really sort of small things. So stepping off a plane into sort of different cultures and just how sort of temperature feels differently, or just kind of your eyes and your sort of mind and your every sense is just kind of collecting data again, and you just feel quite energized and almost like life is rich again, because you're just able to sort of expose yourself to sort of to different sort of stimulus. And I feel that I've been so kind of blessed in that regard, because when I've then been at home or kind of working at home for a prolonged period of time, so from the end of December in 2020 through to sort of our first race this year in March, I found it really, really hard. I really struggled being at home for that period of time with shorter days and missing that sort of interaction of people, and not being exposed to kind of new stimulus. So I certainly recognise how fortunate I've been, and yet when that's been sort of taken away, perhaps it's really sort of emphasised when it's not there even more, because I've sort of had maybe more highs or lows.
Ellie, I can totally relate to that, and on some level, clearly not the sitting on chartered planes by myself, but certainly now we're kind of coming out of this, certainly getting back into the real world again. It's amazing. There's a new acronym popping up, which is IRL, right? In real life is starting to be the new thing now. So you got either going to do a remote meeting or IRL. Incredible. But nevertheless, I wanted to pick up on something you said around the thought around stepping into the unknown, because I think, quite honestly, having tracked your career and done the homework, it feels like that's what you're all about in many ways, and probably no better person to be dealing with this from the Formula One perspective than yourself as you go into the last day, really into those unknown territories. But coming back to the thought around taking a job in an industry which is clearly male dominated, which is in many ways from a career perspective, I'm sure, a slightly higher risk move. Love to think and get your thoughts on some of the motivations as to why you decided to get into this space. Was it a childhood dream come true, or something that you stumbled upon?
It's a great question, Rich. I mean, I grew up in the countryside, so lived on a farm. Have always been just fascinated actually by how things work. Really sort of love anything with an engine. From a very young age, it was like I just really would like to learn to drive, and find speed exhilarating. So, in the UK when I was a kid, it was always on the sort of TV, and obviously it was just easy to access, sort of BBC, ITV for a period of time, and that would be on. But I then had a long period where I didn't sort of watch or follow any sort of Formula One. So I would say sort of mid-90s through to me joining the sport in 2017, I didn't watch or follow any Formula One. But the passion for cars and track days and speed kind of really remained with me. So that I sort of love. And there was maybe the sort of draw and the appeal of that. But I think if I look back through my sort of life so far, I think what I've always sort of done is maybe zigged when others have zagged. And I've kind of been okay with that. There are times when I will definitely feel sort of drained or exhausted, that I'll sort of notice I'll be potentially sort of oversensitive, because I always feel like I'm sometimes kind of pushing against a current. But actually, for the most part, I draw energy from that. And I think from when I was very young, I went to what was an all-boys school that had just gone sort of co-ed. So I was always sort of one of few. And that was sort of from the age of sort of, I think must have been 6 or 7 years old, which is most really quite kind of formative to just feel okay. Being a girl in amongst kind of what was then sort of up until very recently a boys' school.
You talked about zigging rather than zagging.
Yeah.
And that's really defined your career in a way. I mean, you've done many firsts. Can you give us the sort of the building blocks of your career and where you think your big breaks were?
So I think certainly I've had chapters that I would sort of define as those kind of big breaks. And Mark, I've been really lucky, I think, because despite sort of the zigging and the zagging, and maybe being driven by sort of being different to a certain extent, the flip side of that is being kind of very sort of self-aware or sort of concerned that I'm not going to fit in or I'm not sort of good enough. And actually the defining career moments have been when I've had a really great support network around me, or I've had sort of senior people inside organizations that have almost been those sponsors and supported, encouraged me and kind of given me those sort of breaks or sort of lifted me up. And I'd say agency side, sort of from which was kind of a very early job before sort of going client side, just having the sort of support from a guy called Ian Norman. We're not related despite the same surname. That was sort of incredible because that really sort of encouraged me. And all I wanted to do was sort of really thrive and to learn as much as possible. And that was kind of really formative because obviously sort of leaving school at 18, I sort of then didn't have any sort of other education. And so actually just that sort of learning on the job, doing sort of IPA and just kind of just learning in a different way was incredible. And actually, from sort of agency side to going client side, again, he was very supportive of, rather than sort of holding me back, encouraging me into sort of a secondment and then that sort of permanent role. And from having that support, you kind of feel like you're good to kind of go. And then the other, once I was in Honda, the president there at the time was a Scottish guy called Ken Keir, and he was sort of fantastic because I think he could see my sort of initiative, sort of animation, the sort of creativity and the sort of, I suppose, the comfortableness with kind of concepts and sort of pushing things to maybe feel uncomfortable. And actually the only question he would ever ask me when it came to a campaign for sort of Honda was, does it make you feel scared? And that's something that I've really sort of carried with me because I've really sort of loved working on challenger brands. And, you know, the more that I sort of look back and reflect, it's been that sort of distinctiveness of being able to sort of cut through and to sort of be memorable. And that question's really sort of helped me again to find the right side of being scared and to see the sort of positive in that. And that would be kind of two examples, I think, sort of throughout. And people potentially kind of start to see you and the values that you sort of hold. And even from sort of there, I was able to get a call from a guy who was at Honda, but I'd never worked for him. He was like, there's a role at Virgin. I think you'd be great at it. You should apply. And then into coming from Virgin to sort of Formula One, again, very fortunate to get a phone call after having been sort of recommended via the sort of creative agency Wyden and Kennedy that I'd be sort of a good fit for sort of Formula One and what needed to sort of happen.
Wow. Ellie, what a trajectory. And there's so many things that I could pick up on. I mean, the first thing, I love the thought that you lifted off your career at the young tender age of 18 and then sort of learnt on the job. And it makes me, by the way, very grateful that you've decided to become a mentor, because that's sort of the role models that we really do need for this younger generation, and particularly when thinking about the role of apprenticeships. So it's just great that you're supporting us in that way. So thank you. The big thing that I want to come on to, and you know, there's something I think underlying and wrapped up in what you've said. This whole being self-awareness and almost worried about fitting in. And then as a consequence of that, then, you know, you're taking your career in ways that, as you say, you know, scare you, but also gives you that ability to then get on the right side of that. And I just want to explore a little bit about maybe the personal toll that then has on you as an individual. And I'm sure many people go through this. I mean, imposter syndrome to some extent or another is in all of us. Yeah. But actually, what are some of the learnings that you've then had on the back of this, you know, the underlying worried about fitting in, but then always at the same time wanting to stretch yourself to almost an extreme level? How do you feel about that? How is that? What's your sense from that perspective?
Richie, I think when I listen to it, I sit here and I'm like, am I just a really complex person? Or because I always think of myself as being quite kind of simple. And I think there's the drive within me, which is almost like two sides of the coin. So there's the sort of recognition that there isn't a formal level of education, and yet inside there is innate curiosity to sort of learn and to improve and to be the best that I can be. And I think that really does stem from carrying with me a sense of, am I good enough? Because I don't have a sort of formal education, and there is obviously a sort of a positive to that and a negative to that. And I think what I often try to do is to always find the sort of positive in that. So at sort of any opportunity, it's a case of, well, what can I read? What can I watch? How can I actually kind of learn about something? Because I genuinely have a fascination and a sort of curiosity for how things work, and never being sort of satisfied that I'm good enough. And I think it's that sort of drive that keeps me pushing forward. And I think that's also what I find really sort of energizing and motivating within sort of Formula One, is maintaining that that sort of level that it can always be better. There's always sort of an opportunity to be really sort of improving and looking for those incremental gains. And I think there's a lot of sort of similarity there. And yet, on the other side, I think there is a openness and a simplicity to me, because what you see is kind of what you get.
Yeah. And we've certainly seen that in this discussion, Ellie. And I mean, I think it's interesting because as what you say, I was watching a video by Jay Shetty this morning, and he was interviewing Gwyneth Paltrow about winning an Oscar, and she said she only needed to win the Oscar to find out that it was meaningless, and it feels like, you know, and then they started describing about some of the motivations behind wanting to win that Oscar, and actually it was only once she'd won was she able to reflect and actually think about some of the underlying things and causes and maybe slightly more unhelpful things in her life that she was then able to deal with. But it was only reaching that pinnacle of success where she then kind of being able to go down the other side of the hill. And I think it's quite interesting, and maybe some parallels.
I think that's funny, Richie, because I never look at myself as being successful or think of myself as being successful. I'm sort of very much in today and sort of just grateful to be part of something that's big, and as my own sort of little piece of that puzzle, able to sort of do the best that I can do each day and to, you know, hopefully make a positive difference, versus ever thinking sort of I'm successful. So I think that's the sort of constant drive inside.
Wow.
I think sorry, I disappeared for a second there. I have my own internet issues for a second. Wonderful. I mean, so a lot of what you've talked about will be very relatable in terms of inherently people doubt themselves, wonder if they're successful. But you talked about wanting to cause change, and so within the context of Formula One, which is a big old beast and has lots of embedded traditions and biases and so on. What change are you looking to affect within Formula One?
Do you know, it's I sort of reference, or we reference, that sort of family feel when you're inside the sport. And you know, before I joined the sport, and certainly when we did sort of big piece of kind of research or sort of diagnosis to start the journey, understanding from sort of fans or non-fans across the world, the sort of perception of it being sort of very closed door, inaccessible, sort of no one could kind of penetrate sort of Formula One. It was so clear as to what needed to sort of happen, and there's that sort of wonderful sort of tension about continuing to drive the sort of quality from within, of being the kind of best, and you're constantly driving progress, but also finding ways to really provide that accessibility and to sort of open it up. And part of that sort of transformation, or the sort of journey of Formula One, has really been to sort of take it on a digital transformation journey from a sort of, I suppose, a marketing sort of perspective, which hadn't sort of taken place up until then. And just really sort of doubling down on like the core product, what makes the core product brilliant, and what have been missing from that sort of core product. Now, clearly, that's a side that I've had nothing to do with, because I'm not an engineer, but thankfully there are heaps of clever people who have spent sort of the last 4 years really sort of defining what those rules within the sport are from a technical and a sporting perspective, and bringing in a cost cap, so to speak, to kind of level the playing field. And it's all of these sort of elements that it's not going to be a silver bullet, but it absolutely will start off the sport in that sort of next chapter to sort of enable that. And I think coming into something, and then this is what I found really appealing, is I've always worked for big brands. I love big brands. I love the sort of fame that brands have, the impact that brands have on people's kind of lives, in terms of just great products, services, how that makes you feel. And having that, but having that with a combination of knowing that you almost have to sort of be disruptive and behave like a challenger to sort of actually start to sort of revitalize actually where Formula One was. And I think there certainly would have been a danger that it could have continued with going into sort of a negative momentum of feeling like the fan wasn't seen or sort of considered to be sort of important. And I think when you sort of understand what those sort of drivers are, really get under the skin of your DNA and where these sort of problems are, it's really great actually to then be saying, okay, so what are we going to do? There's opportunity everywhere, but where are we going to focus, and actually how do you sort of drive about making sort of those changes? And I think that's what I sort of really love, is being able to kind of imagine just how things could be, and to almost find where the sort of tension or the jeopardy is. And sometimes that can be really extreme, and it won't be language that necessarily kind of shows up externally, but I love using the provocations of those sort of opposites or kind of extremes where you can find the sort of tension. And I think that's quite an interesting place to start to sort of unlock.
Absolutely brilliant. I love that sort of that thought process there. And before we continue on, I just want to kind of pick up on a few comments. Comments are coming in quick and fast, by the way, and a couple of questions from the audience. So just a couple of things. First of all, Richard, thank you for your comment there. So great point that asking yourself if you're good enough makes you ask yourself how you could be better. So that's a really nice thought there. Joe K, thank you again. Lots of great comments from you. So very, very modest Ellie. Thank you so much for sharing your life and experience with us. The way you reason through things shows a very bright mind with a great inner strength. Just what I need for this Friday morning. What a lovely comment there from Joe K. Thank you very much for that. I've got a question from Selena that I want to pick up on. So if you had to describe to someone the best, most effective way to work with you, like an operating manual for yourself, what would you say?
That is a fantastic question.
Good, isn't it?
Really, really good. So I think if you had an Ellie operating manual, the first thing that would kind of be in that operating manual would be these sort of core values. So what's really, really important to me, and that's a basis of trust and honesty. So I love to initiate things, and I want sort of to find ways to kind of work together. So it's certainly a sort of positive frame of mind. And I think often I will sometimes need a sort of counter, because I am very optimistic. And it's always great to sort of have a counter and to sort of maybe stress test through things. I like to know everything that's kind of going on. So the worst thing, and this is again a counter to maybe sort of putting yourself in these uncomfortable sort of positions to learn, but I don't like surprises. So I'm really happy when we're kind of pushing work and we're going into kind of new places, but I'd much rather know kind of what's going on. I love my team to have a energy to be pushing and trying things, and that sort of desire to sort of look at where the improvements can be made. Thinking kind of big picture, so how do we start to join sort of dots together, so that sort of lateral thinking, and thinking much more freely versus kind of silos. And it's just literally, for me, it's about knowing all of everyone. So I would much rather know if someone's having a great day or kind of a bad day, and actually then how do I need to be to get the best out of you. So a team for me in my manual to sort of say, actually, can you stop doing this, or can you start doing this, or I need this from you. I'm often driven by wanting to help people, to be able to kind of please people, to make people kind of happy, and that will be my sort of driver versus driven through fear.
I just want to pick up on one point that you made, Ellie, before I pass back to Mark, and I want to ask about what's your perspective on failure, because a lot of the time, first of all, the high risk industry that you operate in, but actually a lot of the things around want to push the boundaries but have no surprises, complete juxtaposition in many ways. And then therefore, when you have an operating within your team, it could certainly be a confused message sometimes. And I'd love to think and hear about what is your perspective on risk reward.
That's brilliant, actually, because I hate the thought of failing and letting people down. And that will most probably show up in, to some people, sort of unhealthy ways, in that I will work until the job is done and sort of delivered. So I'm not very good at not sort of delivering, or feeling like I'm not going to deliver. And that comes from not wanting to fail and not wanting to let people down. And that's a really sort of hard place to kind of get to, because not everything is always going to work out. But I think it's detaching the sort of personal from being able to almost take the project out and almost kind of sit it out, and almost to look at it quite sort of independently, and to be quite kind of logical at how you then evaluate that. And again, to use it as a mindset of, okay, if we do this again, what would we do? And what would we not do? And which are the areas that we could kind of do better? Because it's getting back into that sort of mindset of, once you kind of pick yourself up from that sort of failure or something hasn't gone to plan. And I always take that sort of really personally, because I feel like it's a reflection on me. But once you're sort of over that sort of pain, it's then being quite logical and being able to kind of like deconstruct it. Say, right, how would you rebuild this? And the way, quite often I will need to just have a weekend, some time at sort of home, a walk, to almost just sort of be able to come back with the sort of energy, the optimism, that sort of inner strength, to sort of remind yourself that the journey that you're on, the sort of the objective or the picture you have in your head, or in my case of how I want that sport to be, by the time I sort of leave the role, or I'm not kind of here, then that's the thing that kind of keeps you coming back.
Totally.
So I would say the stamina and resilience actually would be sort of two of my kind of strengths. I would never describe myself as a sprinter, but I'm kind of pretty good at getting into a marathon.
I'd say more than pretty good, Ellie. We've got a couple of really great questions, but unfortunately we're getting out of time. So it is the time for the last question. Amazing where the time goes. You've already given lots of sage messages, wonderful insights, but to a younger audience at the beginning of their career who may or may not have an education, what would your words of advice be in terms of finding their way in the world?
Be really curious. I think, despite sort of everything I've shared with you today and my own sort of inner sort of feelings or kind of fears, just be open. Just don't say no to sort of anything. And I think if I sort of reflect, and some of the sort of conversations I listen to, or the sort of observations I have, there is a real impatience to life with younger people. And I think often the definition of success can be sort of quite externally focused. It could be a salary or sort of a title, and sort of maybe sort of more material things of what will other people think of me if I have X, Y, and Z. And I think the more that I'm sort of in the world and kind of getting older, grayer, let's hope a little wiser, the more I would sort of say none of those things matter. So yes, you need to have a sort of safe, healthy environment, and be able to kind of support those that you love around you, but none of that matters. So I think any opportunity, really sort of evaluate it. And even if it doesn't fit on your sort of straight line, it's fantastic to have a few little zigs and zags and kind of go around the houses. And I think that makes you as a person, as a leader, as a friend, sort of a much richer person. You can add more to other people. I think, that patience is so important. We're always in such a rush. And I say that working in a sport where those drivers are kind of going around the track at 320 kilometers an hour. But it's like, it's okay. We can take our time. And the journey is the most enjoyable, important thing, far more than the destination.
Wow. Ellie, that's such a lovely way to close the session. At this point in time, me and Mark usually just kind of have a few reflections on the session and some of the key themes that you talked of. So let me have a go first to try and summarize some of the things you spoke of, and then I'll pass over to Mark. I've got to kick off and start where you talked about you're not a sprinter, but you want to run the marathon. And I think that's just so important when it comes to the success that you've had, recognizing some of the undulations. And the fact that you have said that you don't even think about it as success is just amazing in itself. It feels like you're very much running your own race. But at the same time, early on in the session, you talked about the fact that you find speed exhilarating. And I love some of the nuanced sort of kind of juxtapositions that you put yourself in, because I think you then talked about this level of discomfort and being uncomfortable and being scared and finding yourself in scary positions. That I think then really drives you and motivates you to push on. And it just fascinated me to think about that, particularly even early on in the talk, you talked about stepping into the unknowns. And it certainly does feel like, whether it's the most recent past of jumping on planes in PPE kits, right through to the your marathon of a career, it just feels like you really have put yourself in some difficult positions and then been able to shine through. Although sometimes you probably don't even realize that you are shining through, which I think is just beautiful. It's absolutely fantastic. The fact that early on in your career, at the young age of 18, you probably decided to take a path which slightly unconventional in today's youth, where you've jump into a job and drive from that point on. And I think that's just super for then just being a role model to what young people are going through right now. The thought about being memorable was another big thought. And perhaps the last one I'll finish on, I don't want to steal all Mark's thunder, is around behaving like that challenger brand and being a challenger and constantly being a challenger. And then therefore, always thinking about the extremes and how you can kind of use polar opposites to make a case, build a case, and then push the boundaries. So what a lovely session, Ellie. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And thank you so much for being a part of the School of Marketing as well.
Yeah, great job, Richie. Just a couple of things to add there. I mean, first off, it's been a treat to have you on. You've given a sincerity and authenticity and honesty, which has been really, soul-filling. I'm going to pick up on one theme that I think has really characterized this session with you, Ellie, which is you talked about, I think I'm quite a simple person, and now I feel like I'm sounding quite complex. I'd reframe that into, I think you're beautifully layered. So what do I mean by that? There's a lot of contradictions at one level in what you've said. I grew up on a farm, which is maybe a slow pace of life, but I love speed. I like tension. I don't like surprises, but I like to push the boundaries. And I think this is what really defines many people's careers, is that they're not straight line. There are nuances, there are subtleties. It's neither simple nor complex. It's just layered. And it's those twists and turns that really define us and our success in life. So it's been an absolute pleasure to hear about you. I think you're doing a wonderful job within Formula One and changing that and improving that from within. I now can confess I'm a massive Formula One fan, so personally it's been a massive treat having you on. But I think you're a lovely person and beautifully led with it. So thank you for coming on the show on behalf of myself and Richie and all the guests. It's been fantastic.
Thank you both very, very much. This is like the perfect start to a Friday. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. Ours is all the thanks. And so, yeah, that's it for this week. Just as a tee up for next week, we've got a double header. We've got Raju Rajaman from Visa on Thursday lunchtime, coming in from East Coast US. And then Ed Smith from Amazon, European Amazon Marketing Director, who also is part of the Marketing Academy Fellowship that I've spent the last couple of days with, coming in on the Friday at normal time, 8 a.m. UK time. So double header to watch out for. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed hearing from Ellie as much as Richie and I have, and have a fantastic weekend. Thank you.